The olive trees were old. Some of them had been there for centuries, their trunks twisted by time into shapes that looked almost like men frozen mid-prayer. He had come here before, many times. But tonight was different. He walked ahead of them, his 11 remaining disciples, and the gap between him and them kept growing. Not because he walked faster, because something in the way he moved made them hesitate to close it. He stopped beneath one of the ancient trees. He knelt. And then, slowly, with the weight of a man carrying something no one else in the garden could see, he lowered his face to the ground. The disciples stood back and watched. None of them understood what was happening. None of them could. This is the story of the last 24 hours of Jesus of Nazareth, the hours that changed everything. The city had been full for days. Jerusalem swelled with Passover pilgrims every year, travelers from Egypt, from Babylon, from Rome, from the far edges of the known world, all of them returning to the holy city to remember the night their ancestors walked out of Egypt, the night God passed over, the night death visited every house that did not carry the blood of a lamb on its doorpost. The streets were choked with people. The air smelled of roasting meat and unwashed bodies, and the incense drifting from the temple courts. Children ran between the legs of strangers. Merchants argued. Pilgrims prayed in languages that mixed and tangled in the narrow alleyways. For most of these people, this was holy. This was sacred. This was the week they had traveled weeks to reach. For the men who ran the city, it was something else. It was a crisis. Passover was always dangerous. 100,000 extra bodies packed into a city already stretched thin. Any spark could become a riot. Rome was watching. The governors were watching. And this year, there was a particular problem. There was a man. He had arrived 5 days ago on a donkey, and the crowd had gone mad. They had torn palm branches from the trees. They had thrown their cloaks on the road. They had shouted a word, Hosanna, that meant save us now. A royal word, a coronation word, the kind of word that made Roman soldiers reach for their swords. He had walked into the temple courts and overturned the merchants' tables with his own hands. He had healed people in public, blind men, lepers, a man who had been lying by a pool for 38 years. And every day, the crowds grew larger. The chief priests and elders had watched all of this and understood one thing with absolute clarity. This man was going to get them all killed. If Rome decided this was a rebellion, if Pilate looked at those crowds and saw an insurrection forming, there would be soldiers in the streets within hours. There had been other messianic movements before. Rome did not negotiate with them. Rome crushed them. The man had to be removed, quietly, quickly, before the week was out. And then, on Wednesday, one of his own disciples walked through their door. His name was Judas Iscariot. He was the group's treasurer. He had been with the man for 3 years. He wanted 30 pieces of silver. The deal was made before the evening was out. But none of that is where the story really begins. To understand what happened in the next 24 hours, you need to understand one thing about this man, one thing that his enemies never grasped, one thing that even his closest friends only half believed. He knew. He had known for months. He had told them several times in plain language, on the road, at the table, in the synagogue. We are going to Jerusalem. The Son of Man will be handed over to the chief priests. He will be condemned. He will be handed over to the Gentiles. He will be flogged. He will be killed. Every time he said it, they had either argued with him or gone silent. They could not make it fit. This was the man who had fed 5,000 people with 5 loaves of bread. The man who had walked on water in the middle of a storm. The man who had called a dead man out of a tomb 4 days after the burial. That man was not going to be arrested. That man was going to be king. They were not wrong to believe that. They were only wrong about the timing. On Thursday evening, he gathered all 12 of them, including Judas, in an upper room in Jerusalem. Someone had arranged the space. There was a low table, cushions arranged around it in the manner of a formal dinner, oil lamps burning along the walls. The smell of the lamb roasting downstairs. The faint sound of the city outside, music, voices, the bleating of animals being prepared for tomorrow's sacrifice. It should have felt like a celebration. Instead, the mood in the room was something no one could name. He had said things to them over the last few days that they were still turning over in their minds. Where I am going, you cannot follow. Not yet. He had wept over Jerusalem from the Mount of Olives, looking down at the temple, the white marble blazing in the afternoon sun, and said something about destruction that none of them wanted to repeat. They took their places around the table, and then, before the meal, before the prayers, before any of the rituals of the Passover Seder, he did something that stopped the room entirely. He stood up. He removed his outer robe. He picked up a towel and a basin of water, and he began to wash their feet. This was a servant's task, not just a lowly task, and specifically servile one, the kind that even Jewish servants could not be compelled to perform. It was so far beneath the dignity of a teacher, a rabbi, a man who had just ridden into Jerusalem to the sound of royal acclamations, that Peter pulled his feet back and said, "No, you will never wash my feet." He looked at Peter. "If I do not wash you, you have no part with me." Peter, who never knew when to stop, then washed my hands and my head as well. The room watched. No one spoke. He moved from disciple to disciple, kneeling, lifting each pair of feet, washing the dust of Jerusalem from them, drying them with the towel around his waist. He reached Judas. He washed his feet too. What does a man look like in the last hours before his death? Not just any death, a death he has chosen, a death he has been moving toward for months, a death that he understands in dimensions none of the people in that room can access to be the entire point. What does that look like from the inside? He knew the garden was coming. He knew the arrest was coming. He even knew which of the men sitting at that table was about to walk out and finalize it. He looked at Judas and said quietly, "What you are going to do it quickly." The other disciples thought he was sending him out for supplies, something for the feast, coins for the poor. Judas left, and the door closed behind him, and the remaining 11 were alone with him in the lamplight, and the mood in the room shifted, like something had been decided. He spoke for a long time. He told them he was going somewhere they could not follow. He told them not to let their hearts be troubled. "You believe in God, believe also in me. In my Father's house there are many rooms." He told them he was going to prepare a place for them. Thomas, who always asked the question everyone else was afraid to ask, "Lord, we don't know where you are going. How can we know the way? I am the way, the truth, the life." Philip, "Show us the Father, and that will be enough for us." He looked at Philip with something in his face that might have been exhaustion. "Have I been with you this long, Philip, and you still do not know me?" He talked about a helper that was coming, something or someone who would be with them after he was gone. He talked about love. "As I have loved you, love one another." He told Peter that before the rooster crowed, Peter would deny knowing him 3 times. Peter objected loudly. He did not change the prediction. And then he took the bread from the table. He broke it. He said, "This is my body, given for you. Do this in remembrance of me." He lifted the cup. "This is my blood of the covenant, poured out for many, for the forgiveness of sins." They ate, they drank. In that room, at that table, with the city celebrating Passover all around them, the night was turning into something else entirely. What was he feeling? This is the question the gospel writers do not flinch from. They do not present a man of stone walking calmly toward his destiny. They present a man in genuine anguish. Earlier that week he had said, "Now my soul is troubled. And what shall I say? Father, save me from this hour." No. It was for this very reason I came to this hour, troubled. The word in the original language carries the sense of being agitated, shaken, disturbed at the deepest level. The same word used to describe what happens to water when something plunges into it. He was not performing distress. He was experiencing it. And that detail, that small, devastating detail, is the thing that changes everything about what happens next. Because a man who is not afraid of what he is walking toward does not need courage. A man who does not feel the weight of suffering does not need resolve. What is about to happen in the garden is not the behavior of someone for whom pain is abstract. It is the behavior of someone who understands exactly what is coming and chooses it anyway. They sang a hymn before they left, the Hallel, the traditional Passover psalms, songs of praise and deliverance, songs that had been sung in Jerusalem on this night for 1,000 years. Oh, give thanks to the Lord, for he is good, for his steadfast love endures forever. The 11 voices in the lamplight, his voice among them. Then they walked out into the night. The Garden of Gethsemane was on the lower slopes of the Mount of Olives, across the Kidron Valley from the city. The name meant oil press. It was an olive grove, probably with a press somewhere among the trees for processing the harvest. The disciples had been here with him before, enough times that Judas knew where to find them. He left 8 of them near the entrance. He took Peter, James, and John, the 3 who had been with him on the mountain, the 3 who had seen Moses and Elijah, the 3 who had seen his face change and his clothes blaze white in a way they had never been able to fully describe. He took them deeper into the garden. And then something happened that none of them had ever seen before. He began to be overwhelmed. The text uses 2 words that press against each other, deeply distressed and troubled. The Greek words ektambestai and ademonein together carry the sense of a man being seized by terror, thrown into a state of shock, unable to contain what he is experiencing. He turned to them. My soul is overwhelmed with sorrow to the point of death. Stay here and keep watch. And he went a little further into the trees. He fell to the ground, and he prayed the most human prayer in the entire Bible. Abba, Father, everything is possible for you. Take this cup from me. Take this cup from me. He was not asking for more time. He was not asking to renegotiate the plan. He was not expressing doubt about who he was or what his mission was. He was asking if there was another way. The cup, in the prophetic language he had grown up reading, was the cup of God's wrath, the accumulated judgment against human sin, the full weight of everything that had ever gone wrong in the world, every act of cruelty and betrayal and violence and shame, gathered into a single terrible moment. He knew what was in it. He asked if it could pass. And then, because this is who he was, this is what the whole story turns on, he said the second half. Yet not what I will, but what you will. He got up. He walked back to where he had left the 3 disciples. They were asleep. He had asked them to keep watch. They were asleep. He woke them gently. Could you not keep watch for 1 hour? And went back. He prayed the same prayer again. He came back. They were asleep again. He went a 3rd time. The 3rd time, he stayed longer. The Gospel of Luke records that his sweat was like drops of blood falling to the ground, a medical phenomenon documented in cases of extreme psychological stress, where capillaries near the sweat glands rupture under the pressure. This was not metaphor. This was a man at the absolute limit of what a human body could contain. And then, the text does not record what changed, only that something did. He came back to the disciples and stood over them. Are you still sleeping? Look, the hour has come. The Son of Man is being handed over into the hands of sinners. Rise, let us go. Here comes my betrayer. There is a stillness in those lines. The anguish of the garden is over. He has come through something, not around it, not past it, but through it. And what emerged from those olive trees in the darkness was a man who had made his peace. Whatever was coming, he was ready. He was still speaking when the torches appeared at the entrance to the garden. A large crowd, temple guards, chief priests, servants, some Roman soldiers attached as backup, moving through the trees with swords and clubs and torches, the orange light fragmenting through the leaves. and at the front, moving ahead of the crowd, walking toward him, Judas. He had arranged a signal. The one I kiss, that is the man. Arrest him. Judas walked up to him. Rabbi, he kissed him on the cheek. He looked at Judas and said, with no anger, no accusation, the simplest possible words, "Friend, do what you came for." And then the guards moved in. Peter, impulsive, terrified, unable to stand still, drew a sword and swung it. He cut off the ear of a servant of the high priest. The servant's name was Malchus. It is one of those strange, specific details the gospel writers include without explanation. The name of a man whose severed ear was then healed by the man being arrested. Put your sword away. Shall I not drink the cup the Father has given me? The disciples ran, all of them. Peter and John circled back from a distance and followed the crowd toward the high priest's house. The rest scattered into the darkness, and he walked, surrounded by soldiers, back toward the city he had wept over from the hillside. The trial, if it could be called that, was a thing assembled in darkness. It was the middle of the night. The Sanhedrin, the ruling Jewish council, had gathered in the house of Caiaphas, the high priest. They were looking for testimony against him, testimony that would justify a death sentence. Witness after witness came forward. Their stories contradicted each other. Caiaphas finally stood up in frustration. "Are you not going to answer? What is this testimony that these men are bringing against you?" Silence. Caiaphas leaned forward. "I charge you under oath by the living God. Tell us if you are the Messiah, the Son of God." The room went very still. He looked at Caiaphas. "You have said so. But I say to all of you, from now on you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of the Mighty One and coming on the clouds of heaven." Caiaphas tore his robe. Blasphemy. What further need do we have of witnesses? The verdict was already decided. In the house of the high priest, in the middle of the night, with conflicting testimony and a rushed process that violated nearly every rule of Jewish law, the council condemned him to death. They couldn't carry out the sentence themselves. Only Rome could authorize an execution. He would have to go to Pilate. Outside in the courtyard, Peter was warming himself by a fire. A servant girl looked at him. "You were with this Jesus of Galilee. I don't know what you're talking about." He moved to the gateway. Another servant girl. "This man was with Jesus of Nazareth. I don't know the man." A little while later, a group standing near the fire. "Surely you are one of them. Your accent gives you away." "I don't know the man. I swear it. I don't know him." And immediately, the rooster crowed. He had been told this would happen. The exact words, the exact sequence, the exact moment. It was happening exactly as predicted. Peter went outside and wept bitterly. In the morning, they took him to Pilate. Pontius Pilate was a man caught between forces he could not control. He governed a volatile province on behalf of an emperor who did not tolerate failures. He had made enemies among the Jewish leadership already. His relationship with the priests was fraught. He did not want another complication. He questioned him. "Are you the king of the Jews? You have said so." He questioned him about the charges. He received no answers. The text says Pilate was amazed. He found no grounds for a death sentence. He said so openly. 3 times, according to Luke, he sent him to Herod Antipas, who was also in Jerusalem for the Passover. Herod questioned him at length and got no response. Herod's soldiers mocked him, dressed him in an elaborate robe, and sent him back. Pilate tried once more. He offered the crowd a choice, a custom at Passover, releasing one prisoner as a gesture of goodwill. He offered them the choice between him and a man named Barabbas, a violent insurrectionist who had committed murder. The crowd, driven by the chief priests, worked into a frenzy, chose Barabbas. "What shall I do with Jesus? Crucify him." "Why? What crime has he committed? Crucify him." Pilate called for water. He washed his hands in front of the crowd. He declared himself innocent of this man's blood, and he handed him over. What followed was not quick, the flogging alone. The Roman flagellum, a leather whip with pieces of bone and metal woven into the ends, left a man barely alive. The Gospels do not dwell on the physical details, but the Roman historians do. It was designed to flay the flesh from the back in strips. After the flogging, the soldiers brought him inside the barracks. They wove a crown from thorns, the thorns of the plants that grew on the hillsides around Jerusalem, some varieties producing spikes more than an inch long, and pressed it onto his head. They put a scarlet robe on him. They knelt in front of him in mock worship. "Hail, King of the Jews!" They spat on him. They struck him across the face. They took the staff they had put in his hand and used it to beat the crown of thorns deeper onto his skull. Then they led him out to be crucified. The cross was heavy. He was made to carry it. The horizontal beam, probably, which a condemned man carried to the site of execution, through the streets of Jerusalem, through the crowds gathered for Passover. At some point on the road, he could not carry it any more. The soldiers grabbed a man from the crowd at random. His name was Simon, from Cyrene in North Africa, in Jerusalem for the festival. They put the beam on his shoulders. He followed behind. The place was called Golgotha, the place of the skull. It was outside the city walls, on a rocky hill visible from the road. Crucifixions were performed in public as a deterrent in places where they could be seen. It was the third hour of the morning. 9 o'clock, they nailed him to the cross. There is nothing cinematic to make of this moment. There is no camera angle that makes it easier to hold. The Gospels describe it in 4 words, and they crucified him. 4 words for the hinge of history. Pilate had a sign made and placed on the cross above his head, "Jesus of Nazareth, the King of the Jews." The chief priests protested. Pilate refused to change it. 2 others were crucified alongside him, one on either side. The soldiers divided his clothing between them and cast lots for his tunic. The crowd passed by and hurled insults. "Come down from the cross if you are the Son of God." The religious leaders mocked him openly. He saved others. He cannot save himself. One of the criminals crucified next to him jeered at him. The other one turned his head. "Don't you fear God? We are receiving what we deserve for what we did. But this man has done nothing wrong." And then, turning toward him, asking the thing that everyone in earshot must have thought was absurd given the circumstances, "Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom." He turned his head. "Truly, I tell you, today you will be with me in paradise." His mother was there, Mary, who had held him as an infant in a stable in Bethlehem, who had fled with him to Egypt when he was still too young to walk, who had raised him in a carpenter's house in Galilee, who had gone looking for him when he stayed behind at the temple at 12 years old, who had watched him at a wedding in Cana and trusted him before he had done a single public miracle. She was standing at the foot of the cross. He looked down at her. He looked at John, the disciple standing beside her. "Woman, here is your son." To John, "Here is your mother." From that moment, the text says, John took her into his own home. At noon, the 6th hour, the sky went dark, not cloudy, not overcast, dark. The darkness lasted 3 hours. At the 9th hour, 3 o'clock in the afternoon, he cried out in a loud voice in Aramaic, "Eloi, Eloi, lema sabachthani." My God, why have you abandoned me?" The opening line of Psalm 22, a psalm written 1,000 years earlier, a psalm that described in precise detail a suffering so specific that later readers could barely believe it had been written before the event. Someone ran for a jar of wine vinegar, soaked a sponge, and held it up to his mouth on a staff. He drank. And then, with what the Gospel of John calls a single word, "It is finished," and what Luke describes as a loud cry, he bowed his head, and he breathed his last. At the moment of his death, the curtain in the temple tore from top to bottom, 60 feet high, 4 inches thick, torn. The earth shook, rocks split, tombs opened. The Roman centurion, who had overseen the execution, stood looking at what was in front of him, at the darkened sky, at the earth still trembling beneath his feet, at the man hanging dead on the cross, and said something that the gospel writers do not present as piety or theology. They present it as observation. Surely this man was the Son of God. A man named Joseph from the town of Arimathea, a member of the Sanhedrin who had not agreed with what they had done, went to Pilate and asked for the body. He was given permission. Joseph and Nicodemus, another council member who had come to him secretly at night years earlier to ask questions he could not ask in public, wrapped the body in linen with spices and placed it in a new tomb cut out of the rock nearby. A great stone was rolled across the entrance. The chief priests asked Pilate for guards, citing concern that his disciples might steal the body and claim he had risen. Pilate sent soldiers. The stone was sealed. The disciples were scattered, hiding, terrified, certain it was over. The Passover Sabbath settled over Jerusalem like a stone. 30 pieces of silver, that is what it cost. Less than the price of a slave under Mosaic law, less than the fine for letting your ox gore a stranger's servant. A rounding error in the temple treasury. Judas, the text tells us, returned the money when he realized what he had set in motion. He threw the coins onto the temple floor in front of the chief priests. He said, "I have sinned. I have betrayed innocent blood. They refused to take it back. It was blood money. It could not go into the treasury. They used it to buy a potter's field, a place to bury foreigners. The field is still called the Field of Blood." Judas left the temple. He went and hanged himself. There is a silence that sits at the center of this story. Not the silence of the garden, though that silence is there. Not the silence of the cell, the silence before the beating. The silence of a man who has decided not to defend himself. A different silence. The silence of a mother standing at the foot of a cross. The silence of 11 men hiding behind locked doors. The silence of a sealed tomb. The silence of a Friday evening, of a Sabbath morning, of a world that has just watched the most extraordinary man it has ever produced die in public disgrace on a garbage hill outside a Roman-occupied city. That silence lasted 2 days. What broke it on the third morning is a story for another time. But this is the story of the hours that made that morning matter. This is the story of a man who was told what was coming and walked toward it anyway, who knelt in a garden and asked if there was another way, and then stood up when the answer was silence, who washed the feet of the man who was about to betray him, who, in the last minutes of his life, arranged for his mother's future, promised a criminal paradise, and forgave the people who were killing him. The question that has followed this story across 2,000 years is not whether it happened. The question is what it means that he did not have to. He did not die because they took his life. He died because he gave it.